Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now, let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty blinds of the modest two-bedroom apartment, casting warm golden streaks across the tile floor. David sat on the couch with a bowl of Gary and groundnut in his lap, his legs stretched, the TV on low volume as Clara swept near the door with light humming in her throat. Their son Leo, just 8, giggled as Muffin, their overly spoiled white and brown cat, batted a paper ball across the living room, sliding on the floor like a clumsy dancer. This was the rhythm of their life. Simple, quiet, predictable. David, tall and dark-skinned with shoulders that curved from the way to work, was a man of few words but deep laughter. Clara, light-hearted with soft eyes and a round face, was a life inside the walls, cooking, organizing, and keeping everything afloat. They didn't have much, but what they had seemed enough. It was a home filled with gentle noises, the swish of a broom, the laughter of a child, and the soft purring of a cat who knew it was adored. Clara always said, "Muffin is not just a cat, she's family." And David never argued. He didn't understand the attachment, not fully, but he respected it. Every night, Muffin curled beside Clara on their shared bed like a baby demanding warmth. David sometimes joked that he was the third wheel in his own marriage. Yet, he was never resentful. His job as a finance manager at a mid-sized logistics company paid well enough, and though he came home tired, he never let the fatigue leak into his smiles. Clara managed the household like a quiet machine. Meals on time, clothes clean, son well fed, and every birthday remembered. David trusted her completely. They didn't go out much, they didn't have luxurious things, but they had stability, routine, and peace. And for David, who had grown up with neither, that was wealth beyond numbers. On Sundays, the three of them, and Muffin in her tiny leash, would take short walks around the neighborhood. Neighbors often admired the family, the man who worked hard, the woman who glowed with peace, the son who smiled at everyone, and the cat that acted like royalty. But beneath that peaceful rhythm were things unspoken. Clara often wished David would spend more time at home, not knowing the long hours weren't from love lost, but from the weight of providing. David, too, sometimes wished Clara would ask him how things were going at work, not just out of politeness, but with real curiosity. Yet neither complained. They were partners in silence, walking hand in hand through an ordinary life, where every tick of the clock meant another small act of endurance. Their apartment may have been modest, but the dreams that filled it were vast. David had been saving to buy a small house on the outskirts of town, a gift to his family that would free them from rent and give Leo a better life. He hadn't told Clara yet. He wanted it to be a surprise. All he needed was just a little more time. Every weekday, before the sun stretched its arms across the sky, David was already up. He'd pack a small lunch, usually rice or EBA Clara cooked the night before, dress in his old but well-kept shirt and tie, and kiss his sleeping wife and son on the forehead before slipping out. The streets were often still waking, but David moved like a man on fire. He hated lateness. He hated mediocrity. At the office, he was the dependable one, the one who stayed back to finish reports no one else wanted, who fixed client accounts even when he wasn't assigned, and who never complained. His boss once told him, "David, you're the kind of man who holds this place together." That compliment didn't inflate him. It reminded him of the pressure. He had mouths to feed, dreams to build, and no family fortune to fall back on. Every kobo he earned was another brick in the house he wanted to build for Clara and Leo. He didn't chase pleasure, he chased peace. But even strong men crack under the weight of silence. When the company started downsizing, whispers filled the break room. David pretended not to hear. He convinced himself that his loyalty would protect him, that his years of sacrifice counted. But on a gray Wednesday, he was called in, handed a brown envelope, and thanked for his service. No severance. No warning. Just like that. He nodded politely, shook hands, and walked out with his world in a box. That evening, he still bought Clara meat pie on his way home. He still smiled when Leo ran to him with drawings. He still helped wash plates. But something inside him shattered. and Clara didn't notice. She talked about laundry. She asked if he remembered to pick up tomatoes. She smiled and said, "Muffin peed on your shirt again." And David in return said, "Don't worry, I'll wash it." That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above him like time mocking him. The next day, he didn't stay down. He dressed again, left the house, and began what would become a brutal new routine. Small jobs, hustles, late nights. He registered as a Bolt driver. He took a part-time shift at a supermarket stockroom. He tutored kids in math on weekends. All the while, Clara continued believing he was still at his old job. He couldn't bear to tell her. She was too soft, too delicate. David often remembered how she once cried for hours when Muffin had a small paw injury. How would she handle knowing that their financial anchor was gone? So he bore it. He told small lies. Traffic was too much today. Office workload is insane. He came home later, looking more exhausted, but he made sure he was always carrying something: bread, meat, cold soda for Leo. So it looked like things were still good. And somehow, in all this noise, no one noticed the cracks growing deeper. Inside the walls of their home, Clara moved with quiet precision. Every day began with breakfast for her boys and breakfast for Muffin, who had a special ceramic bowl shaped like a fish. Clara had bought it from a local artisan just to make Muffin's meals feel more personal. She wasn't crazy. She knew Muffin was just a cat, but in a world where everything felt like it could change overnight, Muffin was her constant. When David wasn't home and Leo was at school, Muffin kept her company. She would curl beside her while Clara folded laundry, or knead her paws into Clara's lap during long phone calls with her mother. Muffin never judged her. Muffin never asked if she was doing enough. And so unconsciously, she poured a kind of maternal love into that furry creature, the kind she never admitted out loud, even to herself. Leo, being just 8, didn't mind. Sometimes he even joked, "Mommy, I think you love Muffin more than me." Clara would laugh and scoop him up, kissing his cheeks. "Never. You're my number one. Muffin is just your little sister." But even David had once teased, "If that cat ever grows wings, you'll let her fly our rent money away." They had all laughed then. No one could have predicted how prophetic that joke would become. Clara doted on Muffin more than most would find normal. She bought her toys, gave her weekly baths, brushed her fur, and even celebrated Muffin's birthday with cupcakes and a silly paper hat. To her, Muffin wasn't an animal. She was family, a silent companion who knew her moods better than any human ever could. David didn't complain. He had long accepted that the cat came first sometimes. But even he didn't realize how deep the bond ran. And then one morning, Clara noticed something strange. Muffin refused her favorite sardines. She sniffed the bowl and walked away. Clara tried chicken, milk, fresh water. Nothing worked. The cat began sleeping more, moving less. Clara panicked. She searched online, tried warm compresses, even mixed food with ground medicine. But the cat only grew thinner, her bright eyes dimming. She didn't tell David. He was already coming home late, shoulders sagging, face pale. She thought maybe it was stress from work. She didn't want to add to it. Besides, she was the one at home. She could handle this. She booked an appointment at a veterinary clinic across town, wrapped Muffin gently in a blanket, and took a cab. As she sat in the waiting room, heart pounding, holding her cat like a newborn, she had no idea that the diagnosis she was about to receive would ignite the beginning of a storm neither she nor David would ever forget. David stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of a gas station restroom, the harsh fluorescent light emphasizing the tired bags under his eyes. His shirt, once crisp and ironed for corporate meetings, now clung to his body with sweat from long delivery runs on his Bolt shift. It had been 2 weeks since he lost his job, and not once had he come close to telling Clara. He had convinced himself that the truth would only break her, that she'd spiral into panic or depression, and that the home he had built with such careful silence would collapse like a card house. His mornings were no longer about office deadlines, but about racing through traffic, dropping off passengers, delivering packages, and tutoring teenage students in small apartments after dusk. It was a rhythm of exhaustion. each job chipping away at his pride, each rejection when applying for new roles stabbing a little deeper into his confidence. Still, he pushed on, clinging to one thing: the savings. The house. At night, Clara would greet him at the door with a smile and a plate of warm soup. Leo would come running with his homework, eager to show a drawing or a math score. And Muffin would sit perched by the door like a guardian, tail flicking as if she sensed more than anyone else. David would smile, kiss Clara on the forehead, and say work was fine. Busy but good. Then he'd excuse himself to take long showers, not because he needed to clean, but because he needed a moment to cry where no one would hear. Sometimes he'd sit in the bathroom fully dressed, water running, just to catch his breath from the burden of pretending. He wanted to tell Clara to sit her down and say, "I'm struggling," but every time he looked at her, so peaceful, so trusting, so full of light, he swallowed the truth like a bitter pill. He didn't want her to carry that weight. Still, cracks had started forming in places he didn't expect. Clara asked fewer questions about work, perhaps because she trusted him too much, or maybe because she'd learned to mind her business. But Leo had started asking why Daddy always looked tired, why he didn't laugh like before. "I'm just getting older," David had said with a smirk, though inside, he was rapidly aging under the weight of his double life. He became paranoid about the savings account. He checked it weekly, whispering prayers that nothing would touch it. It was his one anchor. 5 years of saving, late nights, skipped vacations, penny pinching, all for a house where his son could sleep without hearing neighbors' arguments, where Clara could plant a garden, where he could finally breathe. Every sacrifice, every lie, was to protect that dream. What he didn't know, what would nearly destroy him, was that the dream was already slipping from his fingers, traded for a truth he never imagined. It began subtly. Clara noticed that Muffin no longer rushed to her food bowl with excitement. The little chirping meows that once filled the air every morning were gone. Muffin lay curled in corners she never used to, her once glossy fur now dull and flat. At first, Clara thought it was just the weather. She changed the food brand, added treats, warmed her milk. Nothing helped. Muffin stopped grooming herself, and her eyes, which always followed Clara around the house with curious affection, began to glaze over with a tired sadness. Clara grew increasingly agitated. She Googled symptoms, watched cat care videos, even reached out to an online pet forum. The fear began to creep in. She didn't tell David yet. He was already looking stressed, always coming home late and worn out. She told herself, "He doesn't need this now. I'll fix it." But Muffin got worse. She began limping slightly, crying softly when touched, and stopped using her litter box. Clara cleaned up quietly, kept the lights dim, and sang lullabies while stroking her fragile spine. She begged the cat not to give up. To Clara, Muffin wasn't just a pet. She was her confidant. During lonely hours of housework and quiet afternoons, while David was at work and Leo at school, Muffin was her companion. Muffin knew when she was sad, when she needed comfort. How could she tell David how much it hurt to see her best friend wasting away? Finally, when Muffin stopped eating entirely, Clara made the decision. She took what little emergency cash they had at home and booked a private appointment with a top-rated veterinary clinic on the other side of the city. She didn't want to wait in line at some overburdened animal shelter. Muffin deserved the best. She wrapped Muffin in a soft towel like a newborn, placed her in the passenger seat of a friend's borrowed car, and drove silently, her heart pounding the entire ride. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and sadness. As she waited, her fingers kept tightening and loosening around the towel, eyes fixed on Muffin's still frame. The vet, a gentle middle-aged woman, took one look and frowned. Tests were done, scans run. Clara waited for what felt like hours. When the vet returned, her face was grave. "Your cat has a very aggressive form of cancer," she said softly. "We can attempt surgery, but it will cost you." Clara's head spun. "How much?" she asked, almost joking. The vet replied, "We'll need an upfront payment of $18,000. The entire treatment and post-surgical care may cost around $20,000. The room tilted. Clara blinked, stunned. That was nearly all they had in savings. But then, this wasn't just a cat. This was Muffin, her emotional compass, her quiet therapist. She didn't know how to breathe through the guilt that began to fill her chest. The days following the vet visit were a blur. Clara hardly slept. She'd spend nights beside Muffin, gently brushing her fur, whispering childhood memories, and praying that somehow, miraculously, Muffin would get better on her own. But deep inside, she knew that time was slipping away. Muffin's breathing was shallower now, her eyes barely focused, her weight alarmingly reduced. Clara thought about the money in their savings account. She knew about it. David had mentioned it offhandedly months ago when talking about their future. "I'm almost there," he had said with a smile. "Just a few more months, and we can finally leave this rented place behind." She knew he was saving for a house. She knew what that money meant. But when she looked at Muffin lying helpless and fading, the line between logic and emotion blurred. "What is a house," she told herself, "if the family in it is broken?" She believed deeply that David would understand, that he'd be upset at first, but once Muffin was alive and back to her old self, he'd forgive her. Maybe he'd even thank her. So Clara made the call. She told the vet to prepare for surgery. That same day, she took David's bank token, something he had shared with her trustingly when setting up joint online access, and transferred the money in full. She cried while doing it, hands shaking, whispering apologies to David in her heart. She typed in the account PIN with trembling fingers, and when the confirmation flashed on her phone screen, she exhaled as if she'd lifted 1,000 bricks off her chest. The vet scheduled the surgery. Clara rode with Muffin to the clinic, holding her like an infant the whole way, praying under her breath. She didn't tell David anything. That night, when he came home exhausted and handed her her favorite pastry, she smiled tightly and said she was tired. He nodded, kissed her on the cheek, and went to bathe. She hated herself in that moment. Hated the lie, the silence, the gamble. The surgery was done 2 days later. Clara waited the entire time in the hospital's lounge, knees pressed together, phone clutched in her hands. Every hour felt like a day. But the vet came out with bad news. The cancer had spread deeper than we thought. We tried everything, but her organs had already started shutting down. Muffin died on the operating table. Clara didn't react immediately. She stood still, staring at the vet as if the woman had spoken in another language. It wasn't until she saw Muffin's tiny, lifeless body being wheeled out in a tray that her knees buckled and the tears came. She screamed into her hands, crumbling onto the hospital floor, unable to process the fact that she had just traded their family's future for a creature she couldn't even save. And yet, when she returned home that night and David asked why she looked so broken, she only whispered, "Muffin's gone." And David, thinking she meant natural death, hugged her tightly, wiped her tears, and promised to buy her ice cream to cheer her up. Clara couldn't sleep for days after Muffin's death. Every corner of the house whispered reminders. The small feeding bowl by the kitchen door, the tiny blanket near the window where Muffin used to sunbathe, even the scratch marks on the couch David had once grumbled about. She moved through the house like a ghost, going through the motions of domestic care, while guilt devoured her from within. Leo noticed her quietness, but assumed it was grief for the pet. David noticed too, but he thought it was just the natural mourning that followed loss. No one knew what Clara had done. Each time she heard David humming as he folded laundry or discussing house plans on phone calls, her stomach twisted. Every smile from him felt like a blade. She had gambled 5 years of his life, of their life, and lost. And yet she didn't speak. The words wouldn't form. Her brain conjured scenarios where she confessed, where David held her and said he understood. But deep inside, she feared that he wouldn't understand, that he'd never forgive her. David, meanwhile, kept up his brutal daily routine. His boat rides were now longer, sometimes ending past midnight. He was trying to meet a deadline with the housing agent who had promised to hold the small property for just a few more weeks. The deal was good, a 2-bedroom bungalow with a small backyard. It wasn't extravagant, but it was theirs. He had pictured Leo riding a bicycle around the compound and Clara finally planting the garden she always dreamed of. It was his vision of peace, a place where his son could breathe fresh air, where rent would no longer chain them, where his family could start a new chapter. The savings account was his crown jewel, his quiet triumph over poverty and every disappointment life had thrown at him. Though the sleepless nights were wearing him down, his knees ached, his back stung, he found strength in the dream. And Clara's recent sadness, he assumed, was simply tied to losing Muffin. He even felt closer to her, as they shared soft conversations at night, their grief seemingly mutual. Clara tried to make up for what she had done in small ways. She cooked his favorite meals more often. She rubbed his shoulders without being asked. She kept Leo busy, so David could rest when he returned home. But every time she saw the happiness in his eyes when he talked about just a few more weeks till we move, she felt like a criminal. She rehearsed confessions in her mind. "David, I took the money. I didn't mean to. I thought I could save her." But the shame crushed her voice. And the worst part was knowing that David had suffered so much in silence. He had never made her feel poor, never made her feel like a burden. He carried everything like a soldier, smiling through exhaustion. The betrayal she'd committed wasn't just financial, it was emotional. She had broken the back of a man who had never once complained. And so she said nothing, praying every day for a miracle she knew wouldn't come. Leo was a cheerful child by nature. He'd inherited Clara's bright smile and David's quiet depth. But in recent weeks, he'd begun feeling weak. It started with headaches and fatigue. He dismissed them, not wanting to trouble his parents. "It's just the weather," he told himself. He remembered how his mother had cried when Muffin died, and how Daddy always looked so tired lately. He didn't want to add to the weight they were carrying. So he laughed through the pain, forced energy into his steps, and smiled when he really wanted to cry. His appetite shrunk, and some days he had to lie about finishing his lunch just to avoid confrontation. Clara noticed the quiet change, but chalked it up to grief. Maybe Leo missed Muffin more than he let on. She gave him juice and soup, made him rest early, and told him to be strong like Daddy. Leo nodded. He was trying, but inside his body was slowly crumbling. The fever came and went like a thief. At night, he'd wake up shivering, hiding his tears under the blanket. His joints ached, his stomach hurt, and his eyes grew pale. But each morning he'd get up, wear his uniform, and say, "I'm fine, Mommy." David, too tired and focused on work, didn't notice how much weight his son had lost. He kissed his forehead and said, "Be good at school," without checking deeper. The symptoms were deceiving, not dramatic enough to trigger panic, yet persistent enough to damage quietly. Leo began avoiding medication entirely. The taste made him gag, and besides, he believed they didn't help. He had tried to take pills once, but vomited and swore he'd never do it again. It was easier to pretend to be strong, to imitate the man he saw come home every day despite pain and struggle. Clara, caught up in her silent storm of guilt and mourning, didn't investigate further. She cooked more vegetable soup, added vitamins to Leo's food, and thought she was doing enough. Meanwhile, David was preoccupied with the final stages of securing the house. He had no idea that his son, his only child, was growing weaker by the day. No one knew how close the danger was. The rent for their current apartment had just expired, and David had asked the landlord for 2 more weeks before they moved. The plan was simple: withdraw from the savings, pay for the house, sign the papers, and finally begin a new life. But in the shadows of that plan, Leo's body was quietly shutting down. And the tragedy was that no one saw it coming, not because they didn't care, but because they were all carrying too much, each drowning in their own kind of silence. David stood outside the small 2-bedroom house he intended to buy for his family. It was a humble bungalow with faded cream walls, an old iron gate, and a small, fenced front yard where mango trees cast soothing shade. It wasn't flashy, but it was theirs. He imagined placing a tire swing in one of the trees for Leo. He imagined Clara painting the walls while humming, hanging new curtains, choosing flowers for the walkway. The housing agent handed him a final document. "Once the funds reflect, sir, the keys are yours." David smiled faintly, gripped the file folder in his hand, and said, "Give me 1 week." He had worked too hard for this, selling old electronics, picking up extra shifts, and even selling his cherished wristwatch. His back ached every morning from lifting packages during night shifts, but it was all worth it. In a few days, they would leave the cluttered apartment behind and walk into a new chapter. That night, he brought home roasted chicken and pineapple juice. Clara was surprised by the gesture. "What's the celebration?" she asked, her voice still dull from morning. David kissed her cheek and said, "I just feel thankful today." She smiled faintly, but her hand shook slightly when she reached for the plates. She wanted to tell him, she nearly did, but something in his eyes stopped her. He looked so hopeful, so fulfilled. She knew what was coming. She had overheard him on the phone, confirming payment plans. She knew he was about to withdraw the savings to seal the deal. Her stomach turned, and the weight in her chest threatened to choke her. After dinner, David sat Leo on his lap and told him, "Very soon, we'll move to a new house. You'll have your own room and your own backyard. Would you like that?" Leo nodded weakly, then leaned his head against his father's chest and whispered, "Yes, Daddy." But behind his closed eyes, Leo felt dizzy. His limbs were heavy. His chest hurt. The next morning, David decided to go to the bank first thing after dropping Leo at school. He had already informed the housing agent that he would make the full transfer before the weekend. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Clara had seemed tense, her smile had been forced, and even Leo's hug had felt too soft. Still, he pushed it aside. He believed the stress would all vanish once they moved. For 5 years, he had given every fiber of his being to this dream. He had suffered in silence, bled in secret, sacrificed rest, comfort, and self-care, all to put his family into a better future. What he didn't know, and was just days away from discovering, was that the very foundation he had built was gone. His wife had already spent the money. The house, his dream, their freedom, all of it was already ashes under his feet. And soon, his world would implode in ways he couldn't imagine. The air was thick with silence when Clara returned from the clinic, her arms wrapped around an empty carrier that once held Muffin's frail body. The cab ride home had felt endless. She kept her face turned to the window, watching buildings blur by, unable to process what had happened. It wasn't just that Muffin had died, it was how. The surgery that she had prayed would be the turning point had turned out to be a meaningless end. The vet had tried. The machines had beeped. But when Clara looked into Muffin's lifeless eyes for the last time, something inside her cracked. The reality hit her in waves. The money was gone, the cat was dead, and David still didn't know. As she climbed the stairs to their flat, each step felt like walking toward her own funeral. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked the door. David was on the couch watching TV, with Leo asleep on his lap. He looked up and smiled, then paused when he saw her face. "Muffin didn't make it," Clara said in a choked voice. She stood there, still wearing the same clothes from yesterday, her shoes covered in dust, the smell of antiseptic clinging to her skin. David sat upright, surprised but not alarmed. "Oh no, I'm so sorry," he said gently, standing to hold her. Clara dropped the empty carrier and collapsed into his arms, sobbing. David didn't ask questions. He didn't press her. He simply held her, stroked her back, and whispered, "It's okay. You did all you could." Later that night, he surprised her with her favorite vanilla ice cream and a pair of socks with cartoon cats on them. Clara smiled through tears, hating herself. How could he still be so good? How could he still love her so easily while she sat on the truth like a ticking time bomb? Every time he looked at her with kindness, it wounded her deeper. He never once asked how she paid for surgery, never suspected that their savings had already been emptied. And she didn't have the courage to break his heart, not yet. In the days that followed, she went about her duties like a machine. She kept Leo indoors more often, citing dust allergies. She avoided conversations about money or the house. David, distracted with finalizing documents and pushing through work shifts, didn't catch on. He even joked that maybe once they moved, they could adopt a puppy, maybe something smaller, something less expensive to feed. He laughed. Clara smiled tightly, her stomach twisting into knots. Nights became unbearable. She would lie awake while David snored gently beside her, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, wondering if there was still time to undo what she had done. Could she take out a loan? Find help from her sister? Replace the funds without him knowing? But the numbers haunted her. $20,000. Gone. Spent. Wasted. On a pet that didn't survive. And the hardest part? She had meant well. She had acted out of love. But the road to tragedy, she was learning, was often paved with the best intentions. It was a Thursday evening when the illusion finally broke. David had just returned from tutoring a teenager in the neighboring estate when he heard Clara screaming from the kitchen. He dropped his bag, heart pounding, and rushed in to find Leo collapsed on the floor, pale, sweating, and barely conscious. Clara was kneeling beside him, shaking him, calling his name in terror. "Now, Leo, wake up. Please, baby, wake up." David pushed her gently aside, scooped the limp child into his arms, and rushed out without a word. The ride to the hospital felt like a nightmare. Leo's head lay against his chest, burning with fever, his breathing shallow. David kept whispering, "Hold on, my boy. Daddy's here," while Clara sat beside him in tears, begging God not to punish them like this. The hospital staff took Leo in quickly, but moments later, a nurse approached David with a clipboard and a stern look. "Sir, we need a deposit of $1,000 before we can proceed with the full treatment," she said. "We can give him fluids, but without the deposit, full diagnostics and care will be delayed." David nodded quickly. "No problem. I'll transfer the money now." He reached for his phone, opened his banking app, and typed in his credentials with confident fingers. But when he checked the balance, the air was sucked from his lungs. Balance, $47.63. He blinked, thinking it was a network error. He refreshed. Same result. He checked transaction history, and his world stopped. A payment of $18,000. Veterinary Surgical Center. Another $2,000 for post-care medication. His hand began to shake. His heart raced. He turned to Clara slowly. Confusion painted across his face like blood on a wall. "Clara," he said, voice barely audible. "What happened to our savings?" She froze. Her hands dropped from her knees. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "Clara," he shouted now, attracting the attention of a nurse. "What happened to our savings?" "The savings for the house. The one I've been building for 5 years." Clara's lips trembled. I used it," she whispered. "For Muffin. I didn't want to tell you. I thought she would survive." David stepped back as if punched. The nurse glanced nervously toward security. "You spent $20,000 on a cat. While our son is fighting for his life." His voice broke and his body trembled. Clara reached out to touch him, but he slapped her hand away. "Don't touch me," he muttered, breath shallow. You killed everything." The hospital staff asked him to calm down, even threatened to call security. But David wasn't violent. He was broken. Leo lay unconscious behind the walls, and here he was, standing in a hospital lobby, learning that his dream, his home, his family's safety, had been sold for nothing. He didn't scream again. He just collapsed onto a chair, hands in his hair, silent sobs shaking his entire frame. A nurse came to him softly and said, "Sir, we need the deposit now." David nodded slowly and said, "Give me 15 minutes." He stood and walked away, to make the most humiliating call of his life. David stood outside the hospital, leaning against the wall as his fingers trembled on the screen of his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, skipping relatives, skipping friends, until he reached Mr. Clement, his old boss. The man had retired, but David remembered him as the one man who always praised integrity and effort. With a deep breath, he hit call. The phone rang once, twice, and finally connected. "David." "My boy," the old man's voice rang cheerfully. But David couldn't respond. "Sir, I need help," he finally whispered. "My son is sick," he collapsed. "They won't treat him until I pay $1,000. But my savings, it's gone." Mr. Clement went quiet for a beat. Then, without asking questions, he said, "Text me the account number." David broke into tears. "Thank you, sir, thank you." He sent the number, wiped his face, and went back inside. Clara was still on the bench, head buried in her hands. She didn't look up. David didn't speak to her. He just told the nurse, "Check the account in 5 minutes. The money will be there." When the doctor finally began the full treatment, David was allowed to see Leo. He sat by the bed, watching his son connected to tubes, looking so small and still. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Daddy's so sorry." He stayed there for hours, watching monitors beep and machines hiss. Outside, Clara sat alone. She had tried to explain, to tell David that she didn't mean harm, that she thought she was saving a life. But how could she explain what David had lost? Not just money, not just a dream, but trust. 5 years of pain and planning, gone. She hadn't asked, hadn't consulted, hadn't even considered their child's future. Her heart broke too, but David's heartbreak was louder. He wouldn't even look at her. She tried to cry, to pray, to make sense of her choice, but all she could do was wait to see if her son would live, and if her marriage had already died. Later that night, David called his bank manager to confirm everything. "Yes, sir. The funds were withdrawn through the joint access. A surgical veterinary hospital, full transfer." David ended the call and leaned back, eyes wide open. The walls around him had collapsed. He didn't know who Clara was anymore. The woman he trusted with his heart, his child, his home, had emptied his future for an animal. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was spiritual. It was a knife in his back, turned slowly. He didn't raise his voice again. He didn't need to. The silence between them now was louder than any scream. Clara finally approached and whispered, "I'm sorry, David." But he didn't respond. He just stared ahead and said softly, "So am I." David sat outside the hospital room like a statue. His elbows rested on his knees, his face buried in his trembling hands. The lights above buzzed faintly, and the hallway smelled of antiseptic and sweat. Behind the glass doors, his only child was hooked to machines, tubes wrapped around his frail arms, his breath shallow. For all the years David had worked, struggled, and suffered, this was the one thing he thought he had safeguarded. Leo's life, Leo's future. But now he sat penniless, humiliated, and emotionally decapitated. He had made the call that no man wants to make, begged an old boss for money, swallowed pride built over a decade just to keep his son alive. And the one person he trusted with everything, his wife, had traded it all for a dying cat. Rage surged through him like a tidal wave, swallowing his restraint. It wasn't just betrayal, it was devastation. He had slaved for 5 years, denied himself food, rejected vacations, sold dreams, skipped sleep. And for what? He stood and walked toward the waiting area where Clara sat alone, her eyes red and swollen, her fingers clenched into her dress. The moment she saw him coming, she stood, hoping for a conversation, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps understanding. But David's face was not the one she knew. His jaw clenched, eyes wild with fury, body trembling like a man barely holding himself together. "You used our savings?" he thundered, his voice echoing across the hallway. $20,000. On a cat. Nurses turned, doctors paused, a few patients looked up. Clara nodded slowly, already crying. But David stepped closer, voice dropping into something more dangerous. "You knew what that money meant. You knew I was saving. You knew we were weeks away from owning a home. And you gave it all away for a cat." Clara tried to speak, to offer some twisted justification. But David wouldn't let her. "While our son was dying," he shouted, "you watched me kill myself to provide, and you spat on it." The hospital staff intervened. A nurse approached carefully and said, "Sir, please calm down. This is a hospital." But David couldn't stop shaking. He wasn't violent, not physically, but his anger was volcanic. Clara reached out, whispering, "David, please. I didn't know Leo was that sick." "I thought." "No," he snapped. "You didn't think. You never do. You just feel. You always feel and expect me to fix it. You broke us, Clara. You didn't just kill a cat. You killed a future." The nurses gently guided him away as Clara fell to the floor in tears. David didn't look back. Something had shattered inside him that no apology could repair. It was the moment love turned to rage, trust turned to dust, and a man who had given everything realized he had nothing left to give. David leaned against the hospital corridor wall and exhaled with a trembling sigh. He was exhausted in every definition of the word. His hands were blistered from labor, his eyes bloodshot from tears, and his soul felt like glass, cracked in 100 places. The only thing keeping him grounded was the sound of Leo's soft breathing inside the room. The doctor had finally begun treatment, thanks to Mr. Clement's quick intervention. Leo had been diagnosed with severe malaria and secondary typhoid, which had progressed dangerously due to delayed treatment. "He's stable," the doctor had said cautiously, "but the next 24 hours are critical." David had nodded, thanking the man before sinking into a chair with his head in his hands. The shame of that moment, of being unable to pay for his own son's treatment because his savings had vanished without his knowledge, was something he would carry for the rest of his life. While Leo rested inside, Clara remained outside, still weeping, still hoping for redemption. But David had gone numb. His heart, which once overflowed with love for her, now burned with a quiet fire. He replayed everything in his mind, the lies, the silence, the smile she wore the night he brought her ice cream after Muffin died. He remembered comforting her, thinking she was mourning a pet, not knowing she was hiding a financial homicide. She had watched him plan that house, speak about it with hope, show her sketches, and she had said nothing. She had watched him work multiple jobs, endure humiliation, and never once offered to confess. The betrayal wasn't a moment. It was a sustained silence, a willful deception. David didn't hate her because of Muffin. He hated her because she let him bleed in ignorance, while she covered her tracks with tears and cooked dinners like everything was fine. That evening, after ensuring Leo was stable, David stepped outside and called Mr. Clement again. "Sir, thank you," he said, voice cracked with humility. "You saved my son's life." The man responded with quiet warmth. "You've worked hard all your life, David. I only did what you would have done for me." That call, brief as it was, reminded David that decency still existed, even if not inside his own home anymore. When he returned to the hospital hallway, Clara tried to approach him again. She whispered, "Please, can we talk?" David looked at her, long and cold. "We will," he said, "after I speak to the police." Clara froze, her mouth falling open. "What?" David continued without blinking. "I'm pressing charges for theft. You robbed me. You robbed us. And I'm filing for divorce. I'll let you visit Leo, but only as his mother, not as my wife." Then he walked away, each step echoing like a gavel in her heart. The woman who thought she was saving love had just murdered it. The next morning began with police sirens instead of birdsong. Clara was still at the hospital when 2 uniformed officers arrived quietly, showed her the papers, and asked her to come with them. The charge: theft and unauthorized access to joint funds. She gasped as David stood at the far end of the hallway, watching without flinching. "David, David, please don't do this," she cried, struggling against their touch. But David had made up his mind. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just looked at her with hollow eyes and said, "Actions have consequences." Clara's cries echoed down the hospital corridor as she was escorted out. The nurses and other patients watched silently, most of them having overheard fragments of the drama the night before. No one needed the full story to know something had broken beyond repair. Leo remained asleep, unaware that the mother who had once sung him lullabies had now been taken away in handcuffs. At the station, Clara was processed, questioned, and held for 48 hours while David finalized his divorce filing. Her family came rushing in, begging him to reconsider. But David remained stone-faced. "She lied. She stole. She nearly cost our son his life. What would you do if it were your child?" No one had an answer. Clara sat in the cold detention room, staring at the wall, her mind replaying every moment. From the first time Muffin stopped eating to the day she typed in David's bank pin. She thought she was being loyal, being loving. But now, all she saw was how blind she had been, how selfish. She had gambled everything without permission. And now she had lost it all. Her son, her home, her husband. And all she had left was a memory of a cat that didn't survive and a family that would never be whole again. David returned to the apartment that night and began packing. Leo was recovering steadily. He arranged for a neighbor to help with childcare while he managed the legal side of things. The apartment felt foreign now, tainted. The curtains Clara had chosen, the throw pillows she'd embroidered, the birthday photos taped to the fridge. All of it felt like lies. He packed Leo's things first, then his. He didn't touch Clara's belongings. He would leave them behind. There was no more room in his heart for sentiment. When he glanced at their wedding photo one last time, he didn't cry. He just sighed, deep and tired. He whispered to the air, "You were loyal, Clara. But you were foolish. And your love cost too much." David stood in the middle of the now empty apartment, staring at the hollow space where the dining table used to be. Most of the furniture was gone, sold for less than half their value just to clear some of the debt left behind by Clara's impulsive decision. The ceiling fan spun slowly above his head, creaking with every turn as if echoing the exhaustion in his bones. The landlord had already handed him the eviction notice. Their grace period had expired. What was once a home built on dreams and quiet sacrifices had now become just another place haunted by failure. David had managed to pay back the emergency loan to Mr. Clement in small installments, but with his side jobs, childcare, and legal fees piling up, he was barely breathing. Leo was recovering well, but even that came at a cost. Medications, follow-up visits, meals with nutritional value. Every naira now had a story, and every decision now had a shadow. Clara had been released on bail, thanks to her sister's intervention, but she wasn't allowed near Leo without legal permission. She had written 2 letters already, long, tear-soaked apologies, and sent them through her sister. David didn't read them. He folded them neatly and tucked them into a drawer he never opened. What would they say that could change anything? "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." None of those phrases could restore 5 years of savings. None of them could undo the shame of begging for money to keep his son alive. Every time David looked at Leo sleeping peacefully, he felt a strange mix of gratitude and grief. His son was alive, thank God, but the price had been too high. Clara hadn't just broken their marriage. She had wrecked the very idea of security David had worked so hard to build. Trust wasn't just about words. It was about respect. And Clara had shown none. With the lease terminated, David moved into a friend's back room in a 2-bedroom flat in the outskirts of town. It was cramped, barely ventilated, but affordable. He promised Leo that it was temporary, that one day they'd have their own place again. And Leo, sweet and perceptive beyond his years, just nodded and hugged his father. He didn't ask about his mother. He had stopped asking weeks ago. David started tracking every expense with the precision of a surgeon. He wore the same shoes every day. He ate once a day. He stopped buying toothpaste until the last tube was flat. It wasn't just poverty, it was punishment. A quiet war against every indulgence that reminded him of what he had lost. At night, he would lie awake on a mattress on the floor, Leo snoring softly beside him, and wonder how a man could work so hard, love so fiercely, and still lose everything. It wasn't fair, but it was real, and all he could do was survive it. The days bled into weeks, and each one left a scar David didn't talk about. Some were on his body, bruises from heavy lifting at his new warehouse job, calluses from long bolt shifts. Others were deeper, silent injuries buried beneath his ribs, where hope used to live. People saw him and called him strong. "You're doing great, David," they said, seeing a man who didn't beg, who still held his head up in church, who walked his son to school every morning without complaint. But no one saw the nights, the moments where he stood in the bathroom with the door locked, just to cry in silence. No one saw how he stared at photos of Leo from happier days, wondering if his son would grow up resenting the way life had turned out. There were days when David questioned everything. If marriage had ever been worth it, if sacrifice meant anything, if loyalty was a fool's currency in a world full of takers. He didn't speak ill of Clara. Not to friends, not to co-workers, not even to Leo. He simply said she was away, and changed the subject. He refused to let bitterness shape his son's future. But privately, her absence was a gaping hole. There were moments, like when Leo got a perfect test score, or when David made his first successful soup from scratch, that he instinctively looked toward the door, expecting her to walk in, laughing, clapping. And then he'd remember she wasn't coming. That the life they built had collapsed under the weight of an emotional decision. He had been many things, a husband, a provider, a planner. But now he was just a man trying to hold it all together for a little boy who had already seen too much pain. And it was that little boy who unknowingly saved David each day. His laughter, his resilience, his innocence. It was during one of those sleepless nights, while watching Leo sleep with a faint smile on his face, that David made a vow. Not the kind made from anger or revenge, but from resolve. He wouldn't chase luxury anymore. He wouldn't cling to lost dreams. He would build again, slowly, brick by brick, even if it took him 10 more years. Not for Clara, not for appearances, but for Leo, and for himself. He began journaling at night, not long entries, just sentences that reminded him who he was. You are still a good man. You are not defined by her mistake. You saved your son. These sentences were his scaffolding, his structure, his medicine. They didn't erase the pain, but they gave it purpose. Because sometimes the strongest people aren't those who never break, but those who rebuild themselves quietly, without applause, when the world isn't watching. 3 months after leaving the apartment, David received a call from a small accounting firm that had found his CV online. They were hiring for a mid-level position, nothing close to what he once earned, but stable, structured, and promising. He went in for the interview wearing a shirt 3 years old and shoes that had begun to crack. He spoke humbly but with clarity. He didn't exaggerate his experience. He simply told them what he had been through, not the personal parts, but the grit, the sacrifice, the loyalty. And they offered him the job. It paid just enough to keep food on the table, savings in the account, and a little dignity in his spine. When he walked out of that building with the offer letter in hand, he didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular, and walked home under the sun with a smile that wasn't loud, but was real. With the new job came structure. Leo was enrolled in a better school, one with kind teachers and a garden. David moved them into a cleaner, quieter apartment. Small, but with working plumbing and steady power. He bought a proper bed, and for the first time in months, he and Leo slept without hearing the hum of a neighbor's generator. He began cooking again, even tried new recipes. They'd eat together in silence, then laugh about how bad his plantain always turned out. Leo began to bloom again. He grew stronger, more curious, more open. David watched and smiled, reminded that children are built for survival. All they need is love, routine, and protection. And he could still give that, even without Clara. Her letters had continued to arrive, still unopened. He didn't hate her anymore, but he didn't trust her either. And trust, he now believed, was love's spine. Once broken, it never stood the same again. One quiet Sunday, after cleaning the house and sharing rice with Leo, David sat on the small balcony watching the evening sky change color. It wasn't the life he had dreamed of, no big house, no family picnics, no wife laughing in the kitchen, but it was peaceful. He had been through a fire, and though it had burned everything, it had also refined him. He was no longer the man who tried to hold everything together by himself. He was the man who had been broken, rebuilt, and returned. Slowly, silently, and now steadily. As Leo joined him on the balcony, resting his head on his father's arm, David looked out into the fading sunlight and said quietly, "We're going to be all right." And for the first time in months, he actually believed it. It was on a rainy Friday evening, 6 months after Clara's arrest and the finalization of their divorce, that David found himself sorting through a box of old documents tucked away in the bottom of a drawer. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just clearing space, decluttering, trying to make the house feel lighter. Leo was asleep on the couch, his school bag by his side, and the television buzzed softly in the background with cartoons. Among receipts, photographs, and old files, David found the stack of letters Clara had written. The envelopes were slightly curled at the edges, some stained from age or rain, each one marked with his name in her distinct handwriting. For months, he had ignored them, unread and unforgiven. But something inside him, perhaps weariness or maybe simple curiosity, pushed him to open one. He sat at the kitchen table, slowly unfolding the first sheet. The ink was smudged in places, either from tears or rushed writing. "David," it began, "I know there are no words that can undo what I did, but I need to try, because silence is worse." She wrote about the day she took Muffin to the vet, the guilt she carried, and the fear that kept her from telling the truth. "I didn't do it to hurt you," the letter continued. "I did it because I thought love meant saving what we cherish, but I never realized what I was sacrificing in return." David read through each word, his eyes steady, but his heart gradually softening. The letters weren't excuses. They were confessions. She admitted everything. Her fear of losing Muffin, her blind trust that David would forgive her, her regret for not asking him, for not waiting, for choosing emotion over wisdom. In one of the last letters, she wrote, "You were the backbone of our family, and I snapped it with my own hands." By the time David finished reading the last envelope, the rain had stopped. A quiet calm filled the room. He wasn't crying, not anymore. He just sat there, absorbing the truth he had avoided. Clara had loved him. That much was clear. But her love had been impulsive, reactive, and tragically blind. He saw now that she hadn't acted out of malice, only out of emotional immaturity. But love, David now understood, needed more than good intentions. It needed trust, patience, accountability. He didn't feel anger anymore, just an aching sense of closure. He gathered the letters, tied them with a small ribbon, and placed them back in the box, not because he intended to revisit them, but because he no longer needed to carry them in his heart. Some stories don't end with revenge. Some end with understanding and quiet distance. Exactly 1 year after Clara had emptied their savings, David and Leo stood in front of a small bungalow painted in soft beige. It was nothing grand, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a small patch of grass outside, and a kitchen that smelled of new paint and wood. But it was theirs, paid in full. No loans, no landlords, no rent deadlines. Just hard-earned ownership. The paperwork was signed, the keys handed over. And as David turned the lock to the front door, Leo ran inside with a squeal of joy. He explored the rooms, the backyard, even the empty hallway, as though each wall held a secret waiting for laughter to return. David stood at the doorway for a moment longer, breathing in the smell of new beginnings. He had built this, not with money alone, but with tears, endurance, brokenness, and slow healing. Inside they had no expensive furniture yet, just a mattress, a small table, and 2 plastic chairs. But they had peace. David watched Leo pull out a framed picture from a bag, a photo of Muffin, printed from an old phone gallery. "Can I put this here?" Leo asked, pointing to a small spot beside the window. David smiled and nodded. "Yes, that's perfect." It was the only photo they had left of her, and for the first time, it didn't hurt. It just reminded him of a chapter, one filled with love, missteps, and lessons learned the hardest way. Clara had not returned. She had moved to a distant town with her sister after the divorce, and while she occasionally sent Leo letters and cards, David kept their interactions minimal, supervised, and spaced. She was no longer a part of his home, but she had left a legacy, a painful one, that reshaped him forever. As the sun set, David and Leo sat on their plastic chairs in the middle of the living room, eating bread and tea, their laughter bouncing off bare walls. No more lies. No more secrets. Just 2 people who had survived a storm and found shelter in truth. "Will we paint my room blue?" Leo asked. David nodded. "Any color you want." Outside, neighbors passed by with curious glances, waving politely. David waved back. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what he had become, a man stronger than his suffering, calmer than his anger, and more whole than he had ever been. Not because life had spared him pain, but because he had endured it. And when he finally whispered into the dusk, "We made it," he wasn't speaking to Leo alone. He was speaking to himself, and to every broken version of him that had survived to see this new beginning. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.